Thank you, Daryl, and uh, thank you also, Christine, for inviting me to talk in this important symposium. Uh, as Daryl has said, I am here from Australia. Uh, Originally, I came from Eritrea in East Africa, so I'm African by descent. Um, Today, I'm going to present to you my research on the economic cost of racial discrimination, specifically in the Australian context, but it can be applied to other countries as well, like Canada and the United States and other countries with multicultural backgrounds. Um, Today, my presentation will be on the cost and the economic cost of racism. Of course, the racism we have been talking about racism from a human rights perspective, but we need also to shed some light on the economic cost to kind of appreciate what kind of harm racism makes and how it can be quantified economically, because the economic imperative also can speak a lot to policymakers, in particular to do something to address racial discrimination in all its forms. Of course, racism hurts people. Indeed, racism hurts society as a whole. However, this hurt is not equally shared. Research indicates that people from minority backgrounds shoulder the greatest burden of racism, either directly from the harm it inflicts or indirectly due to the inefficiency accruing from it. The whole society ultimately bears the impact of racism and associated discrimination. If I would like to give some definition of racism. Racism can broadly be defined as a belief and ideology in racial hierarchy based on socially constructed markers of identity, such as race, skin color, eye shape, hair texture, ethnicity, ancestry, nationality, and birthplace. Racial discrimination refers to the actions and behaviors that unfairly privilege and oppress individuals or groups based on these attributes. When researchers refer to racism, they often combine the ideology or attitudes and behaviors or actions. Different psychometric scales and measures of racism developed in social psychology, sociology, and social epidemiology have items that indicate attitudes, perceptions, enactments of racism. And we also know that there are different forms of racism. They can be subtle or overt and blatant. And researchers also talk about different levels of racism: interpersonal, institutional, structural, and systemic, and internalized. Next slide. In the literature, we have also different disciplinary perspectives on racism. For example, in sociology, the significance of racism lies in the hierarchical structures and power relationships that produce inequalities and oppression. And from economic point of view, racism or racial discrimination can be looked at as the suboptimal or inefficient economic choices that result from non-economic factors entering the underlying utility maximization behavior of individuals and groups. And my focus will be in this aspect of racism. Next slide. And the literature also, there are a range of theories that have been developed to understand racism and how it affects society as a whole. And there have been numerous conceptualizations of racism, including old-fashioned racism, the overt, the blatant, and the biologically determined conception of race as the basis for racism, and then this new racism that has been developed over the last 30 or 40 years, and a range of theorists have described new racism in different ways, including laissez-faire racism, aversive racism, modern racism, ambivalent racism, symbolic racism, and other descriptions of the new forms of racism that do not entirely depend on biology to determine the notion of race and racism, but they depend on culture, on identity, and other essentialized aspects of othering groups and minority groups. And a range of measurements approaches were also developed to measure the prevalence and impact of racism, particularly in the field of social epidemiology and public health. Among these are the everyday racism scale, experience of discrimination scale, racism and life experience scale, the schedule of racist events, and among others. Next. Now I want to look at the impact of racism as a phenomenon. The full economic cost of a particular social phenomenon involves three major parts. The first is direct. This refers to direct monetary outlays such as out-of-pocket expenses incurred in order to address that particular phenomena. This usually represents financial expenditure. The second aspect is also an indirect cost or the indirect impact. It represents costs that are incurred as a result of the phenomenon, which are essentially domino effects. But my focus today will be on the other aspect, and it's called intangible costs, which represents the harm and pain and suffering that is incurred by the person who experiences this racism. And this in particular focus on the health aspect of racism and of including physical and mental health. Next. And in measuring the economic cost of racism, I followed four steps. But first, I focus on determining the prevalence of racism. Then I use an association between racism and health. That means the impact of racism on health, on people's health. And then from this, I determine the burden of disease that is attributable to racism and racial discrimination. And then I convert what is estimated. The estimated burden of disease is converted into dollar values to determine the economic cost. Next. So the prevalence of racial discrimination, it is usually, we find this kind of data from national surveys, of course, nationally representative surveys across, which is conducted in census and other surveys across many countries. So internationally, a range of studies have been conducted on racial discrimination, detailing its widespread prevalence. And the US, for example, the Gallup poll found that between 1997 and 2013, between 18 to 24% of Black people reported experience of discrimination. And in the UK, the British Social Attitude Survey found out that between 25 and 38% of immigrants experienced racial discrimination. Next. And in Australia, there are a range of data sets that have been collected to show how prevalent racial discrimination is. This is from the Australian Human Rights Commission. It shows us data between 2005 and 2020. So you can see on the average, almost 400 people complained about racial discrimination to the Australian Human Rights Commission. Next. Other Australian data sets also show us that the prevalence of racial discrimination is very high, to the extent of almost 20% between 2007 and 2019. We see a kind of an upward trend, as we see in the red ones are the ones that I use for my analysis, because it was done prior to 2014. Next. And this is from another survey, Challenging Racism Project. And in this survey, 22.3% of Australians experienced racial discrimination. Next. This is another survey from Social Research Center, and it shows that almost 37.4% of those who experienced racial discrimination experienced it often, between occasionally to often. Next. So I use next. So I use these prevalence estimates to determine the amount of the economic cost. So this is, of course, we can have labor market costs that determine the indirect economic cost of racial discrimination, but currently I'm focusing mainly on the intangible costs that are related to health, including pain, suffering, and the other kind of illnesses. So the hypothesis is that racial discrimination is costly to an economy, substantial in terms of lost output, in terms of GDP, and the benefits of interventions to reduce racism would outweigh the costs. That's the underlying assumption or hypothesis. Next. So based on these, I follow these 4 stages. First, the prevalence of racial discrimination, and then association between racism and health, to determine the burden of disease attributed to racial discrimination, which is estimated in terms of DALY estimates. This DALY is the disability adjusted life years. It's a common parameter that is being used in health economics. Next. So the prevalence of racial discrimination, as we have seen in the data that I presented, on the average between 5 to 24% of Australians experienced racial discrimination across age and gender groups. And another data that I have is also from Association of Racial Discrimination and Health. This is based on a meta-analysis that we conducted. And in this meta-analysis, we found out that there are almost 16 major illnesses that are directly associated with experiences of racism. Racism causes this or is associated with these 16 major illnesses, including physical and mental health. Overall, the association results between racial discrimination and negative health outcomes gives us a clue as to whether, to what extent racism harms human health. So in this study, I focus mainly on 4 major illnesses that based on the uniqueness and the availability in the global burden of disease. So this analysis allows me to do the estimate for 4 major illnesses. Next. So these are the 4 illnesses. As you can see, racism is significantly associated with anxiety, depression, PTSD, and a range of psychological disorders. This idea tells us that the odds of having experienced depression is 2.1 times higher for those who experience racial discrimination compared to those who didn't experience racial discrimination. So you can see how harmful racism can be to a person's mental health. Next. So this association that I showed you and the prevalence estimates allow me to determine the DALI, that is to estimate the costs in terms of disability adjusted life years, that is years of life lost due to the illness. And this method is also based on a range of parameters that are provided by a guideline for the global burden of disease. So what DALI tells us is it indicates the number of years lost due to illness, disability, or death. So then once I estimate the DALI value, then I am able to convert it into monetary value based on international best practice methods. This approach uses what they call the value of statistical life approach, which is a technical concept that's utilized and it applies the willingness to pay method to estimate the cost of 1 year of life lost due to mortality or disability. That means how much a person is willing to pay in order to increase their longevity by 1 year. So that is the basis of this analysis. Next.
I'm sorry, Dr. Elias, we have just a few minutes left.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up as soon as possible. So the value of statistical life approach is a well-known method, and for my analysis, I use the value of life year, which is estimated to between 3.7 to 9.6 million for a single life year. This value of life year is converted at a rate of $162,561 per DALI. So each DALI, each year of life, is valued at $162,561. Of course, we conduct also sensitivity analysis using a 0 to 10% discount factor range and 3 scenarios between 3.7 million and 9.6 million. So using these parameters, then I estimate the DALI value. Next. So finally, this is the finding that based on the estimation parameters that I have shown you, the final result is this. This tells us what amount of disability adjusted life years are lost because of these 4 illnesses that are attributable to experiences of racial discrimination. When people experience racial discrimination, they are related to these illnesses and how much does it cost in terms of health cost, negative health outcome. You can see next, I'll show you next. This is in terms of dollars. The previous slide is showing us in terms of DALI values, but this is the dollar value when it is converted based on the parameters I just showed you. So you can see from here, there is a significant cost that is incurred with almost $37.8 billion altogether, which is almost roughly at 3% of the Australian GDP. And you can see also for different illnesses where depression tends to be the highest contributor to the cost. Next. This just summarizes what I have been saying. The economic cost of racism in Australia amounts to be around $38 billion per annum, and this is roughly 3% of GDP. You can find this detailed analysis of this and the findings in this publication. But just to give you a rough idea about that, the smoking is estimated to account for 204,000 dollars lost. But for experience of discrimination, the amount of dollars lost is 235,000. So you can see for a comparison how much it is costly to experience discrimination within a society. Next. Okay, this is kind of summing up. These results indicate that the largest burden of disease attributable to racial discrimination among women was depression, $44,000, while among men it is the psychological disorders that result from experience of racial discrimination, amounting to $32,000 lost. Overall, the total burden of disease attributable to racial discrimination for the four illnesses is $235,000 per annum. This means 8.9% of all dollars or disability adjusted life years lost in Australia from all causes, 8.9% is caused by racial discrimination. In general, experience of racial discrimination accounts for a total of $37.9 billion in health costs to the Australian economy. This is roughly 3% of the GDP over the period 2001 and 2011. Next. And next, I think, okay. In conclusion, racial discrimination harms people, and specifically people from minority racial backgrounds. Internationally and in Australia, a growing trend of its prevalence over the last decade, as I have shown you in the data. Many costs of racial discrimination, example, labor market costs and health costs, are incurred, but here what I showed you is only related to health. So the direct and the indirect costs haven't been measured in this study. If we were to measure this, then the cost would be significantly higher. The health cost of racial discrimination in Australia amounts to incur somewhere around 285,000 in terms of dollars. This is wrong. It's $37 billion, so which is 3% of GDP. And you can see from this, substantial cost savings may be possible through a reduction of the prevalence of racial discrimination. If we engage in reducing in policies that reduce racial discrimination, then we can achieve a significant cost savings within the Australian society by legislation, not only legislation, but also anti-racism actions and efforts can lead us to a significant cost reduction. So anti-racism has an economic dividend, and racism has economic cost. Thank you.